Mixed martial arts is the most entertaining sport in the world, and the fight business is pretty much solely represented by the Ultimate Fighting Championship, the UFC. Most people who aren't fanatics of MMA directly associate the sport with the UFC, as the brand is much bigger than the sport itself. Even when it comes to more hardcore fans, it's very rare to see anyone closely following other MMA organizations, for example like the PFL, One Championship, or Rizin, even though they are considered the second biggest promotions. With this type of grasp on the business, bald fuck Dana White and the UFC often gets away with pretty much everything they do, since we, the fans, often will still tune in no matter what because of the lack of options. When compared to boxing, the UFC prides themselves on putting on entertaining events and having the best fighting the best. However, the UFC have been able to get away with pretty much putting on lackluster, meaningless events that have zero implications to the ranking, the title, and moving the sport forward for a very long time.
I see where this is fucking going.
But what if I tell you that this will no longer be the case? What if I tell you that there's still hope? And what if I tell you that the UFC will be forced to change? Up until now, you will see many MMA YouTubers describing the UFC as a monopoly, but from an actual business standpoint, the UFC is not a strict monopoly, since monopoly stands for just one seller of a product. Legal experts and economists frequently describe it as a monopsony, which means a dominant buyer with a near monopoly market power. While rival organizations like PFL, One Championship, and Rizin exist, the UFC controls roughly 90% of the mixed martial arts market revenue and top-tier talent, leading to major antitrust lawsuits over suppressed fighter pay, which we will discuss later. But what if I tell you that the UFC won't be able to get away with this forever? Tune in and you will find out. Before we get into that, we have to talk about the UFC as a business. At the beginning of 2026, Paramount became the exclusive US distributor of the UFC under a 7-year agreement with an average annual value of $1.1 billion. In return, the UFC is expected to supply around 43 live events per year, with 13 of them being number events, which we love, and 30 fight nights in our favorite Apex arena. Not always in the Apex, but you get what I mean. Every covered event streams on Paramount Plus, and the full contract has not been publicly filed, which consequently many operational requirements including minimum bout counts, card quality, and cancellation provisions remain confidential and undefined, which I believe the UFC have been taking a lot of advantage of in many ways. For instance, the UFC was already known for putting up absolute dogshit slops in the Apex, even back in the ESPN days. Just looking at this year after signing the Paramount deal, we have countless horrible, horrific, horrendous, unstacked fight nights and Apex events. For example, the Ankalaev versus Guskov, absolute horrid. UFC Azerbaijan was unstacked even though it had a great main event. Manal Kape versus Kyoji Horiguchi was banished into the Apex instead of having them fighting somewhere like Japan, for example, where they both have a huge fan base. And Bilal Muhammad versus Gabriel Bonfim was pathetic, where Bilal died in the Apex and got left there forever. Arnold Allen versus Malkozal Costa card was atrocious. Aljamain Sterling versus Yusuf Zalal was forgettable. Gilbert Burns was sacrificed to the MMA gods for Mike Mallet in Canada. And last but not least, Moicano versus Duncan was probably one of the worst cards I have ever seen being presented. Keep in mind, I'm not suggesting that these fight nights or Apex cards don't have good fights or hidden gems, but the point of this is not about the fight itself. Is that the UFC is not putting on any meaningful matchups together and putting no effort for the fans. We have to sit through countless terrible cards to get to a number event that often has lackluster matchups as well. Under the previous arrangement the UFC had with ESPN Plus carried UFC programming, but the viewers generally paid an additional fee for numbered pay-per-view events. While previously the UFC still had problems with banishing things in the apex that us viewers often complain about, but for the most part, pay-per-views would have stacked events from top to bottom. However, again, the Paramount model places numbered events and fight nights behind Paramount Plus subscription without additional UFC pay-per-view charge, which means the UFC no longer had a direct incentive and reason to build number events capable of convincing consumers to spend additional money, since that money is now guaranteed. A major champion superstar could directly increase the event's transaction revenue by selling more pay-per-views back then. But now with Paramount, the UFC just had to make sure they provide subscriber growth and retention to advertising revenue, which makes the UFC's financial incentive more closely connected to fulfilling year-round programming schedule and maintaining long-term value of the rights package instead of building attractive individual events. It pretty much is like going from a sales position to a fixed salary, hence the diminish of efforts. To summarize everything very quickly, Paramount benefits when the UFC attracts new subscribers, produce required events, and generates advertising inventory. Now what that means in English is that the financial payoff is less directly tied to the number of people buying one specific event. And as a consequence, we have been seeing the UFC now spread major fights across a calendar instead of concentrating them solely to maximize pay-per-view purchases. That's why we see events like UFC 330 with an amazing main event, but the rest of the card has practically no ranked fighters. I strongly believe that the absence of individual pay-per-view sales is directly reducing the immediate financial pressure to make every number event feel exceptional. From a business standpoint, the UFC is not structured like the NFL, NBA, or any other franchise league. It is currently centrally controlled sports promotion and media company operating within TKO Group Holdings. TKO is publicly traded in the New York Stock Exchange under the symbol TKO, and UFC is operating segment inside TKO rather than separately traded public company. The UFC CEO Dana White oversees UFC operations, but major financial, governance, and capital allocation decisions ultimately sit within TKO's corporate structure. We can see the data from TKO Group's official second quarter in 2026 financial results report published on August 3rd, 2026, where you can see that there's approximately a 17.8% decrease in revenue coming from live events. And I believe that simply comes from UFC putting less effort into number of events and fight nights, therefore selling less tickets. It is not uncommon for companies to try and reduce costs as much as possible instead of catering to its consumers, and it is very disappointing as a fan. Another thing the UFC does that is horrible and many people voices concern for is fighter pay. I'm going to do another video breaking down fighter pay structure in detail, so I'm not going to go crazy here. But just to put things into perspective, compared to other sports, according to my own research, for athletes in terms of annual salaries, some public compilations have estimated average annual UFC earnings at approximately $150,000 in 2022, which the NBA has approximately 79, yes, same as Togi's IQ, 79 times the UFC's estimate at roughly $12 million on average. However, I believe this could all come to an end, and that is because of the rise of Jacob Paul's Most Valuable Promotions. Most Valuable Promotions has evolved from a Jake Paul Center boxing promoter into a global combat sports company. And the scariest thing to baldy Dana White is the partnership MVP has with Netflix. Netflix gives MVP worldwide distribution without requiring fans to purchase any traditional pay-per-view events, and Netflix is just a much bigger platform, yeah, I said it 3 times, compared to Paramount Plus. Also, MVP and PFL announced a merger, not a conventional acquisition. The combined company operates under the MVP banner and brings together nearly 400 boxing and MMA athletes, boxing and MMA. MVP contributes promotional reach, cultural relevance, while MVP has relationship with platforms like Netflix. They also have international infrastructure and existing distribution agreements with ESPN and other broadcasters as well. MVP also promotes itself as Fighter First and has paid record-breaking purses to certain stars. MVP-PFL merger creates more credible challenger for several reasons. First of all, there's strong media competition. The combined company retains relationship with Netflix, ESPN, Sky Sports, and dozens of international broadcasters. And Netflix especially gives MVP the potential to reach casual viewers who never, maybe not never, but who wouldn't really go on Paramount Plus. And they also pose as a viable alternative for fighters. PFL already has hundreds of contracted fighters. I mean, most of them are fucking bums, but if MVP provides higher guaranteed purses, greater sponsorship freedom, or stronger personal brand support could attract established UFC fighters when their contracts expire. Also, even if MVP does not overtake the UFC, a legitimate second promotion gives fighters another bidder. Also, when it comes to marketing advantage, Jake Paul reaches a younger and more casual audience that's traditional MMA promotion have sometimes struggled to attract. MVP can turn fights into entertainment events that extend beyond dedicated MMA fans. Because you see, if when it comes to UFC promotion, the UFC acquired Bo Nickel like he's gonna drive so many fucking wrestling fans, but it doesn't seem like it's the case. He just gets a lot of hate. Okay, regardless of that, boxing and MMA crossover events could also be an option for MVP, which because the combined roster allows MVP to create boxing matches, MMA fights, and these events under one promotional umbrella, which Dana White's Zuffa boxing, a fucking joke, is refusing to do. He's not allowing UFC fighters to come and box, which is very stupid in my opinion. But anyways, beyond all of the points that I just mentioned, MVP can really take off if they take a page out of the UFC's book with the Ultimate Fighter and Contender series by having a Netflix fighter show following a similar model. This would definitely attract an insane amount of viewers that has never even seen a mixed martial arts event previously. And they will subsequently tune into more and more MVP events since it will be on Netflix. People will just click on it. Even though for now, MVP is not yet an immediate threat to the UFC's overall dominance, since the UFC still possesses major advantages such as being the strongest and most recognizable MMA brand, with fighters that are recognized as the world's best, longer standing, and greater institutional experience. They have history and extremely established championship that fighters view as the sport's most prestigious, and still a large global fan base and extensive media distribution and far greater proven revenue generation. For the MVP-PFL, Netflix exposure alone will not solve a lot of the problems it has unless viewers return regular for MMA events. The most realistic near-term threat is not that MVP replaces the UFC. It is that MVP could weaken the UFC's control over fighter employment, media distribution, and compensation. If MVP successfully combines PFL's roster with Netflix reach and Jake Paul's promotional abilities, fighters may gain greater leverage. The merger threatens the UFC's market power before it threatens its position as the sport's #1 promotion, and it could force the UFC to change how it operates. Historically, for most elite fighters, competing in the UFC has been the clearest path to recognition. The problem is that this dominance has also given fighters limited negotiating power and put them into very vulnerable positions. If they reject the UFC contract, there had been historically very few alternatives that can offer comparable money and worldwide exposure. The new MVP-PFL organization could begin changing that dynamic, and the most immediate effect could be higher fighter pay. If MVP begins offering UFC free agents larger guaranteed purses, signing bonuses, individual sponsorship opportunities, or more flexible contracts, this could force the UFC to improve its own offers to keep important fighters. Even athletes who never intend to leave could use an MVP offer as a leverage during negotiations, which is very good for them. Managers might be able to demand higher guarantees, shorter contracts, better pay increase, and fewer restrictive extension clauses. MVP could also attract fighters by allowing them to compete in both boxing and MMA, like I mentioned previously. That would be extremely appealing to UFC athletes who believe major boxing match could earn them more than several MMA fights. The UFC could respond by approving more crossover opportunities, but could also tighten its contracts to prevent fighters from competing elsewhere. Competition could also pressure UFC to reconsider sponsorship for fighters and fighter benefits. UFC currently have limited freedom and display personal sponsors during events because of the promotion's centralized commercial agreements. MVP could differentiate itself by giving athletes more control over their sponsorship income and personal brands, like how the UFC did back in the Wild West days. If fighters begin earning significantly more outside the cage under MVP, the UFC may have to increase its promotional compliance payments or create new ways for athletes to share sponsorship revenue. The same applies to benefits. If MVP eventually introduced stronger health coverage, injury protection, retirement contributions, or guaranteed minimum activity, the UFC would face pressure to explain why the industry leader does not provide comparable protections. However, it is important to emphasize that MVP has not yet announced a complete benefit or revenue sharing system, so its fighter-first approach still has to be proven across the entire roster. MVP could also influence how the UFC distributes and promotes its events. Since Netflix is such a huge platform, it makes MMA much easier for casual audience to sample, and if MVP consistently succeeds on Netflix or continue to have success on social media and personality-driven promotion, it could also push the UFC to invest more in fight promotions and individual fighter storytelling. Maybe we can finally fucking get face-to-face interviews again. Overall, I don't think that MVP could necessarily suddenly overtake the UFC. It's pretty much impossible. But I do think it's more than possible that the UFC will have to compete harder than it has been in years, which will generally make the UFC better and force this bald gambling fuck to put in actual work towards the best sport in the world instead of fucking around gambling and promoting fucking Zuffa boxing. Thank you guys for tuning in to this long ass video. If you guys enjoy my content, please like and subscribe. You guys have no idea how much it will help me. Will the UFC finally improve once and for all? Or will it be slop Apex events again?